Well, Carlos, I saw you made a pretty good tweet, somewhat viral, I guess, or I guess not viral, but a tweet that got quite a bit of traction in response to this woke imperialist video about Cuba. So, you want to dive into that topic first?
Yeah, let's do it. It didn't take much effort, and it was like a sentence that I wrote and fell asleep like 2 minutes after. So, not my best work on Twitter, but yeah, let's watch that video. I think it's. I mean, the importance of like covering this video is not just like the particular thing it represents with relationship to Cuba, but the fact that this is like a more general trend. And I hope to tease that out with you a little bit as we watch the video and see the sort of general principle that we can see embedded in the particular.
For sure. Before we play the video, I just want to quick show people this tweet from Christian Smalls because I think this is important context. This is obviously probably the most famous labor organizer in the U.S. right now. Someone who was instrumental in organizing Amazon. And he recently tweeted, "You don't become a communist just by visiting Cuba, you become a revolutionary." And um, it's worth mentioning that he's also black. He's a person of color from the U.S., labor organizer from the U.S., upholding Cuba and talking about how he wants to bring revolution here to the U.S. So obviously, this is going to cause fear and anger from the ruling class, from the bourgeoisie. And I think that there's a good chance this video may be a response to this tweet. I'm not sure. But either way, it's interesting context as Americans are starting to figure out, how nonsensical the anti-Cuban, anti-communist propaganda that we're fed every day is. And yeah, so here's Carlos's brilliant tweet that he made 2 minutes before falling asleep: "A bag of lies to serve woke imperialism." I love it. But yeah, anything to say before we jump into the video?
Yeah, I had talked about this in the last stream I had done alone. Just the importance of the figure of Chris Smalls for our moment, and in the context of like the last at least 70, 80 years of the labor movement in the US, where like the big figures of the labor movement were complicit with US imperialism. And we have friends of ours who've published articles on, how like the AFL-CIO and some of the leading unions in the U.S., how they were part of the process of like overthrowing Allende's Chile in '73, and and being a part of this process that really gets neoliberalism kickstarted. And it's extremely paradoxical because that neoliberalization, deregulation, austerity, attacks on unions, and social measures that's done to Chile comes home as well around in the same decade. So to have a figure like Chris Smalls, which is by far the most popular labor leader at the moment in the U.S., go to Cuba, see the Cuban reality through a positive light, argue for the lifting of the blockade, be inspired by the Cuban Revolution, and argue that we need something similar here. That's just like all you can hope for from the organic intellectuals of the working class and the working class militants for today, to realize that the things that we actually want as working people will not be acquired through these small scale reforms that are always subject of being recalled by the capitalist class insofar as they continue to have power and we continue to live under their state and their institutions. When working class leaders begin to question the system itself, to postulate that we need a system that is where not only the working class is in power, but that the institutions are created to serve working people and the masses in general, and not to, keep labor down in the interest of capital. That's extremely dangerous, especially when it's conjoined with supporting actually existing socialism, which the Western left is notoriously bad at, and that's part of one of the three central critiques I provide in my book, The Purity Fetish and the Crisis of Western Marxism. So it's extremely exciting what we're seeing with Chris Smalls, and we're going to start seeing a bunch of reactions against it. And I'm hoping that, and I think he does have the courage to, keep moving forward and not be burdened by all of these reactionary voices that are going to paint themselves as the most woke and the most progressives, and tell him not to support Cuba and do what this lady here is doing.
For sure. Yeah. The opportunism that the trade union movement has always been riddled with has been generally opportunism for imperialism. You know, like these imperialist wars might lead to a better standard of life or higher wages for workers here domestically, so we're going to support it. So to see that the primary labor leader in the U.S. right now is moving towards a place of anti-imperialism and a solidarity with global revolutions is a very big deal, and it's very great to see. Which shows us why, as Cobra Commander says, the DNC is going to be working overtime to try and combat this narrative. And I'm sure they'll be calling Christian Smalls the tanky or whatever. I'm sure Voosh and all these progressive socialists, pseudo-socialists, will come out against him sooner or later. But let's check out this video, a message to Black Americans from Cubans regarding Che Guevara and Fidel Castro. So I guess this isn't a message for us. It's only Black Americans, but I have a Cuban man sitting right here with me. So I feel like I guess you're qualified to talk about this.
Half qualified, not black grandma though. So I don't know, maybe a little bit more than half qualified, but
There you
who
go.
knows?
And I'm 168th qualified. My great grandfather.
Start by saying, Black people in America. Hi, my name is Grecia Ordóñez. I'm a Black Cuban, and I want to warn you about the dangers of communism. We
Sorry, I have to stop it already. I'm always skeptical when people like lead with their race, or their gender or some identity group, because there are times like maybe I'm Cuban, okay, right? Or I guess if you're gonna comment on something, you could say I'm a Black Cuban if you're gonna comment on issues that affect the Afro-Cuban population. But you could tell when they're saying it like this when she's in this super expensive art gallery or whatever. She's just gonna hold that identity over you and say, "This is why I'm correct. I am correct because of my identities, because of the color of my skin," which is a deeply reactionary idea, that we would judge people's arguments based on the color of their skin rather than the substance of what they're saying.
Right. It ends up being just this tribalism that the people that critique wokeism from the left, that's what they're pointing at. It's a tribalism that tries to pass itself off as progressive, but it's in terms of worldview, it's rooted in the most reactionaries of philosophical worldviews that have from the time of the Enlightenment been the ones that opposed the universal declarations of humanity and the forms that took in the critiques of Eurocentrism, and then it gets embodied through the philosophy of Carl Schmitt and then Foucault, and these worldviews that at times they present themselves as progressives, at times they're openly Nazi and fascistic, but it is the philosophical ground of the tribalism behind this form of wokeism.
speak Black liberation. Meanwhile, we are idolizing white figures like Che Guevara and Fidel Castro. Che Guevara was a privileged kid that was born in a privileged family that went to a university and one day decided that he didn't want to study anymore and he wanted to go around Latin America and play hero, right? Do you guys know about savior complex? That's exactly what he had. Let me tell you something else.
How dare he? That bastard. He traveled to the poorest parts of Argentina, gave up all that wealth that his family had, gave up the life of privilege and comfort to go around on a freaking moped and, offer his doctor services, because even though apparently he was lazy and left school, he was a doctor and studied deeply. And he wanted to take his skills as a doctor and bring them to the poorest areas of Latin America. He has a savior complex. Don't you know that we live in capitalism, Che Guevara? Don't you know that you're just supposed to let millions of people die because they don't have access to healthcare? How dare you try and bring those people healthcare? And especially, how dare you try and change the structure of the system? How dare you try and change things structurally so that the thousands and thousands of people who are dying every day in Latin America because they didn't have healthcare, are able to live? How dare he? That's a savior complex. Absurd. absurd way to characterize Che Guevara. If a white person in America did that, went around on a freaking moped bringing people health care, and then tried to change the structure of the healthcare system, they would be held up as a hero, I think.
Right. And I mean, even from the start, before he became like socially conscious and actively tried to emancipate really humanity, but Latin America first, like just the character that he had as a person. If you read his diaries while he's traveling across in a motorcycle with his friend around Latin America, um, it's the type of person that would take off the jacket off his back to give it to someone that needed it, and it doesn't matter if that person was a stranger. He was just there's a story from he's in this camp, I forget in what country, and he's treating the sick, and he uh, the sick people that he was treating had like illnesses that were contagious, and the doctors were extremely cold, and they would go up to them with like gloves, and that was like one of the mandatory things, gloves and masks. And Che just would go up to them, no gloves, no mask. He would give them like hugs, he would give them handshakes, he would play soccer with them, and he was just an extremely human person. He embodied the best of what it meant to be human. And that's why in Cuba, the slogan that like kids say is pioneers for communism strive to be like Che. It's not because Che was white or because he was, he had the savior complex. It was because he was an exemplar human being who was constantly participating in self-criticism and trying to make himself better. And it's so ungrounded in anything close to reality what this lady's saying.
Yeah, and I said if there was a white American who did the same thing Che did, they would be held up as a hero. That's not entirely true. I want to correct that statement. If someone went around and did what Che Guevara did, but didn't try to change the system structurally, they would be held up as a hero. Right? If he just went around to the poorest places in Latin America, sacrificed his family's wealth to try and bring people healthcare on an individual level, oh, he's a hero. He's bringing people charity. But since he said, no, these problems are structural, these problems, the mass poverty and mass wealth inequality around us and lack of healthcare around us, lack of education around us are because of capitalism and because of imperialism, and therefore the working masses should rise up. That's when he becomes a villain to the capitalist ruling class. Because you're allowed to, do charity and do acts of kindness on an individual level. But as soon as you start talking about structural change, that's when it's evil and you're a killer and a dictator and blah, blah, blah. And she can say all she wants, that Che was just a white person trying to tell the black Afro-Cubans what to do. But without the black Cubans, the revolution would not have been successful. There's no way Che and Fidel could have done the revolution with just the two of them. It was because the black Cubans had been exploited for years and years and years, and oftentimes brought over on boats and kept as slaves, and were the most exploited members of the Cuban working masses, that they were willing to rise up. They were willing to rise up because of the exploitation and the oppression that they felt on a daily basis. So they joined Che and Fidel's revolution. So you can try and say it was an all-white revolution or whatever, but the darkest, brownest, and blackest Cubans were the most oppressed Cubans for years, and they were the first ones to hop on board with the revolutionary struggle. And then the struggle would have been unsuccessful without them.
And we're a part of the leadership, like when, and not just with black men and mulatto men, but also with like women. Like if there's one thing you can't shit on Cuba for, even if you have this very representationalist, liberal, woke framework to see the world through, if there's one thing you cannot shit on Cuba on is how diverse their leadership politically, how diverse their professionals, how diverse they have been in terms of race and sex. They have like more than half of positions in politics, and professionals and state functionaries are women. So they have even more women in positions of power than men. And in terms of the percentage of the population that's black and the percentage of black leadership, it's either roughly the same or a little bit more leadership than population. It's so even by their very superficial liberal logic, Cuba's excelling. And to lump because we defended Che, we have to defend Fidel. It's it's insane. It's just so insane to say Fidel was just a privileged white guy. Like, we're talking about someone who sent things to Africa, to Angola, to South Africa to fight off apartheid, while the U.S. was funding the apartheid regimes. He sent resources and people that Cuba couldn't afford to really send at that moment because it was developing. It had lost most of its human capital that fled to the U.S. once the revolution hit. It had been stuck with certain bad harvests, and it was in this interregnum where it was trying to figure things out, and it was sending brigades all over Africa because they were asked by the liberation movements in those countries. So to say that the one figure that outside of Africa that probably played the biggest role as a leader in helping the liberation of African nations from the grips of colonialism and apartheid and racism, to say that he was just a privileged white person, come on, man.
I mean, even if you want to look at his individual life, he was the son of a wealthy plantation owner, but he was the illegitimate son who was forced to work on the plantation. And, that's largely what radicalized him, the fact that he saw all of the people who were basically enslaved by his father living on these company towns. And because he was the illegitimate son, he didn't have, the same privileges. The dad kind of tried to hide Fidel and just make him work. And he rose to become this prominent political figure by his own merits. He pulled himself up by his bootstraps, if you will.
There
And
is no
as
one
Count,
more.
just real quick, as Count Orlok 22 says, Cuba offered sanctuary to the Black Panther leadership when they were being targeted by COINTELPRO and brought up on bogus charges. And Asada Shakur is still in Cuba. Many of the prominent Black Panther leaders that have faced political persecution from the U.S., they're in Cuba. They were given a sanctuary in Cuba, and their experience in Cuba is one where they say that, some say either racism isn't existent, others say they're actively trying to combat the little bit of race prejudice that still exists. That's a leftover remnants from the colonial experience that Cuba had to live under for 300-400 years.
More black blood in their hands than Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. They intervened in the Congo War, but in 2021, if you do your research, the Congo government had to issue an apology for the genocide committed in that time. Not just that, how can you be for black people in other countries while the black people in your country are being...
That's like saying that Stalin intervened in Nazi Germany, and the government later on of West Germany would have to apologize for the genocide. That's how the level of stupidity that is. Just because they were involved, now they're tying the numbers of deaths, which were the deaths that were brought about by the apartheid government that they were fighting against, to Cuba. It's like the sort of logic that not even a kindergarten kid would provide, just because of how insanely stupid it is.
And when did Che go to the Congo? It was after the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the Lion of the Congo, the socialist organizer and leader in the Congo that promised to bring the people healthcare and education and economic development before he was assassinated by the United States. So then Che went to help and try and reorganize the people in the Congo who followed Lumumba, who had become, splintered because of that CIA infiltration. And it was unsuccessful because they weren't well organized. But to act like Che Guevara was the one killing black people and, destroying countries in Africa after the CIA killed Lumumba and did everything they could to destabilize this region, and Che went to try and help organize the people, is just a complete inversion of reality. It's an inversion of history and what really happened. And then she's got the nerve to be like, if you do your research, says me in this like giant Western museum, if you do your research, you'll know Che killed all these people in the Congo. I have done my research about that issue. You're a fucking liar.
Kept as political prisoners and oppressed. There was no equality for black people under that dictatorship. Wake up.
I have woken up, and that's why I can see through liars like you. That's why I don't hear, oh, I'm a black Cuban, and immediately think, oh, I have to listen to this person. Because I realize how the empire weaponizes wokeness, how they weaponize identity to try and stop anything that's beneficial for the working masses, for regular people, and for black people in Cuba. This person in reality is arguing for the US empire to overthrow the Cuban government that's brought black people healthcare, that's brought black people freedom, that's brought black people education. Like, I always like to bring this up because this is like my favorite wrestler of all time, Mijan Lopez Nunez, four-time Olympic champion, right? If there's no revolution, this guy is probably just working in a plantation for his whole life under some Western capitalist landowner or some comprador landowner. But instead, because they did have a revolution and because they did bring freedom to the working masses of every color and ethnicity, shape, and size, their people are able to pursue things like sports. They're able to pursue intellectual pursuits. They're able to not die when they're 22 because they can actually afford healthcare. None of that was a thing before the revolution, right? But you want to talk about how the revolution oppressed black people. Look at Cuba before 1959. Look at how black people were doing. They were working on plantations. If you go back further than that, they were being brought over on boats as slaves by the Western imperialists. And then today you have black Cubans winning 4 Olympic gold medals and educating themselves and pursuing degrees and becoming doctors. Like, what the hell are you talking about? It's the complete inversion of reality. It'd be like saying Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War oppressed black people in the U.S. You know, the war to free the slaves actually put black people under horrific oppression.
I dive from two of these
Oh,
comments.
sorry.
One of them from Where Pilgrim. She's got a PhD from PragerU. And Joseph George, Latin Candace Owens. Yeah, it's absurd, and all of those programs are like free, which is a big difference from pretty much anywhere else in the world that's not socialist. These people are developed thanks to the Cuban system. They're given all of these opportunities that are inaccessible even to many people within the imperialist core. They become successful, and then once they're like the top of the line successful, a lot of them are attempted to be bribed by the interest in Miami and the Cuban diaspora to speak out against the government. And it's ridiculous. Just look at it from like the government standpoint. You have spent all these resources on developing these people and making them into who they are. And then once they get their prime and they have the capacity to then give back to society what society has given to them, they're bribed by the the people in the core of the empire and the imperialist core to turn against their government and talk trash against a government that is responsible for all the virtues that they have been able to accumulate over however long they have been training. So it's absolutely disgusting, but this is something that we have to talk about because it's been used against Cuba for a very long time. It's been used against Venezuela. We had someone from, I don't remember if it was The Nation or Politico. I think it was Politico. They had reached out to you to do an interview on, whether you were supporting Maduro's oppression of LGBTQ people or fake solidarity with LGBTQ people. We have to understand that, whether you want to call it woke washing or whether you want to call it wokeism, I don't care. The point is that the liberal wing of empire, which is the most successful in legitimizing empire ideologically, needs to paint these missions that it's doing and attempting to topple the governments through hybrid warfare that are outside of its sphere of influence. It needs to moralize these missions in the same way that the Christian Crusades moralized their missions. And the way that they moralize it today is through wokeism, through appealing to these issues of black minorities or of Muslim minorities in the case of China with the Uyghur, or of LGBTQ people. And all of these issues are instrumentalized by empire in order to get well-meaning people to go in line with their imperialist narrative. It's it's what allows for the most successful form of atrocity propaganda, because the sensibility of the vast majority of people within the empire is such that they are in tune with racial injustices, with sexual injustices, with gender injustices within the imperialist core. And so they use that same language that they're used to tying to progressive movements in the imperialist core. They use it in order to provide atrocity propaganda of governments that they don't like, that they want to try to overthrow, and get the consent of the people within the imperialist core. And if we don't fight against that, if the only time we critique imperialist ideologies when it comes out of the conservatives, we're being one-sided in our war of positions and our ideological warfare against capitalist imperialism. We can't defeat bourgeois hegemony if we're only criticizing one form of it, especially when the form we would not be criticizing if we don't attack, woke imperialism or woke-washed imperialism. That form is the most dominant one. It's the most successful. So this video from this lady, it's a general trend, and in Cuba it's been used with the San Isidro movement. It's a movement of black artists that are supposedly being suppressed and oppressed, but yet somehow they're still free to come in and out of the country to meet with Trump and with DeSantis in Miami, and to get funded from Radio Marti and TV Marti and all these sources of diasporic media that have received over the last 2 decades, according to the Cuba Money Project that's ran by Tracy Eden, they've received more than $1 billion of U.S. taxpayer money. More than $1 billion of U.S. taxpayer money has gone to these anti-Cuba regime change operation fronts that are now the most successful in the countercultural movements in Cuba, with the rap scene and with the San Isidro scene. And this is their bullshit thing that they say, oh, there's political prisoners. Where are they? Where are the political prisoners? That's the question that they've opened themselves up to international organizations coming and proving that there's political prisoners, and there's no fucking proof. It's bullshit. They get people that got arrested doing illegal things. People that got arrested doing illegal things, they get those people and they say that they're political prisoners. And the people that do get arrested in ways that are tied to politics, what would we do to someone who was arguing for the overthrow of the American government and getting funded by China? What would we do here in the US if that was what was going on? Would we not throw those people in prison? We have to fake that people are being funded by Russia, as in the Uhuru movement and the and the leaders of the African People's Socialist Party. We have to lie about them being funded in order to prosecute people that are just fighting for the truth and are just exposing the truth and the lies of empire that are being pushed in order to legitimize this proxy war against Russia. And now it's just insane. But we have to critique this woke imperialism. And if you have an issue with us calling it woke imperialism, and you reject engaging in this critique because you're offended by the word woke, you are little different than the conservatives you claim to hate, who accept everything about socialism, but then you throw the word out and they flip out. It's stop getting mad at words. It's the word that best describes, in my view, the term that best describes this concept. And yeah.
It is interesting how many liberals will accuse conservatives of being in an echo chamber and just being resistant to any other ideas, but then they don't see that they're also in a similar echo chamber. And that's why this critique of wokeism is so important. And going back to what you said about the Politico article, they reached out to me for a comment of trying to do, basically a woke imperialist article, saying that Maduro was weaponizing LGBTQ rhetoric for, to be a dictator or whatever. And because we had an understanding of woke imperialism and we knew exactly what they were trying to do just from the question that they asked us for a response for. So I sent them a very detailed response giving my exact opinion on Maduro and LGBTQ rights in Venezuela and the struggle for, LGBTQ emancipation and things like that in relation to the class struggle and the struggle for socialism. And guess what? I was the only person they reached out to whose comment they didn't use. They decided that our comment was too thorough, that they couldn't take it out of context and use it to argue for imperialist purposes. But that's the point, right? Because they're trying to weaponize your compassion. They're trying to make you think, oh, I as a leftist, I care about other people. I'm empathetic. So therefore, I want to overthrow the Cuban government because, clearly that's what's, in the best interest of minority groups or Black Cubans or the LGBTQ population, when When no, you know, there are different struggles related to that going on in these countries, but these are struggles that we have to allow to play out, and imperialism doesn't care about these struggles. Imperialism is trying to weaponize these movements, weaponize the struggles of different oppressed groups to try and make the situation worse, to try and do what's in the interest of finance capital, to do what's in the interest of Western multinational corporations and the State Department and NGOs. So if you don't realize the way that these arms of imperialism are weaponizing wokeism to argue for imperialism and imperialist intervention, then it's going to be easy to fall into it, right? It's going to be easy to be tricked or have your compassion weaponized. So it's necessary to have a structural understanding of this, a philosophical understanding of this, and break this down. Because as Carlos said, it is the number one form of imperialism right now. They're not telling you like, let's go get Russia. Well, a little bit, but they're not telling you, let's go get these countries and destroy them. They're telling you, don't you care about these countries? You don't support overthrowing the Cuban government and assassinating Putin? Well, you're a piece of shit who doesn't care about black people, right? We cannot fall for that, and we have to deconstruct it and call it out for what it is, which, you know, the term woke imperialism, as Carlos said, and I agree, works very well to do that.
With Russia, they say, "Oh, Putin is horrible on LGBTQ issues," and it's not that he's not up to the standards of Western liberal morality on these issues. It's true that he's not there yet, but they take a kernel of truth and then they magnify it into, oh my God, he's killing gay people, he's doing all these horrible things, which is not true. And the evidence that they usually provide, specifically when it's tied to a socialist country, is as reliable as the evidence that you can find for Santa Claus's existence. But it's, you know, there's this really good quote that Count Orlok 22 put. We are here today recognizing our great debt to the Cuban people. What other country has such a history of selfless behavior as Cuba has shown for the people of Africa? It's honestly, it's disgusting what it is that video's trying to do and trying to insinuate, which is, you know, again, part of this general logic of empire at this specific stage.
Yes.
And the empire.
What? Go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say this and then I forgot it and it just came back to me. But this is all the while black people and poor white people and Hispanic people and people with mental disabilities are still being fucking lynched in the US. They're still being lynched by the police and by, you know, vigilantes, as what happened now in New York at the train station. That happens all the fucking time. To thousands of people, disproportionately black, but also white people and Hispanics who are killed in the street by cops and by other vigilantes of sorts. You know, those are forms of lynching that are still going on in the empire at rates that you won't find any parallel to those rates other than the ones you find in fascist states.
Yeah, but why would we do anything about that when we can overthrow the Cuban government?
Right.
Yeah. It's not like every time the U.S. overthrows a government, more extremist terrorist groups rise up and to fill the power vacuum. This is, by the way, I forgot. Carlos just reminded me that we actually published. That's a funny thumbnail. We actually published our response to Politico. So if people are interested in reading that, since they wouldn't publish it for us, even out of context,